She counted the coins twice. The second count gave her the same number as the first, which was not enough. It was not enough by the specific amount that made the situation not a matter of budgeting, but a matter of choosing. And the choosing was between the medicine on the counter and the food for the week. And there was no version of the arithmetic that gave her both. She had been doing the arithmetic in her head since the doctor had told her what Iris needed 2 weeks ago, when the cough had started. She had been doing it every morning and every night, and in the spaces between the sewing work that was the sum total of how she kept the two of them alive in Cedar Bend, Wyoming. In the January of 1883, and every time she had done it the number had come up short, and every time she had told herself she would find a way, and every time the way had not presented itself. Now she was standing at the counter of Greer's General Store with the medicine in front of her and the coins in her hand, and Iris at home with the cough that had kept them both awake for 2 weeks. She did not mean to cry. She had not cried in 8 months. She had been through the funeral and the debt and the moving and the 8 months of managing everything alone in a town that did not know her, and she had not cried through any of it. Because crying required a surplus of interior resource that she had been spending on other things, and because the crying, once started, was the specific kind she was not certain she could stop. And stopping was not something she could afford to be uncertain about when Iris was watching. Iris was not watching now. Iris was at home with the cough. She cried, and the man behind her in the line, who was large enough to make the store feel smaller and quiet enough that she had not heard him approach, reached past her and put the money on the counter without a word, and when she turned to refuse, because refusing was the only response available to a woman who had been managing alone for 8 months, and for whom accepting help was the specific vulnerability she had never learned to afford. He looked at her with dark green eyes that were patient and entirely without the particular quality of pity she had been bracing against. And he said in a voice so low it was almost only for her, "Don't apologize for crying. Welcome to Cowboy Ironheart. If this already has your heart, let us know you are here." There is a particular kind of strength that does not announce itself. It does not stand with its chin raised and its shoulders squared, and its eyes meeting yours with the clear-eyed certainty of someone who has decided they are not going to be broken. It moves through the world at the speed of the next task, with its hands already reaching for what needs to be done before the current thing is finished. With the specific forward momentum of someone who has learned that the stopping is more dangerous than the continuing, and who has therefore organized their entire existence around the continuing. Willa Cross had that kind of strength, and it had been keeping her and Iris alive for 8 months in Cedar Bend, and it was the thing that was also in the way of fires burning in spaces too small for them, consuming her from the inside at a rate she had not yet allowed herself to fully account for. She had not always been this way. That was the part she thought about sometimes in the early mornings before Iris woke. In the specific gray pre-dawn quiet of the rented rooms above Mrs. Daltrey's dress shop on the main street of Cedar Bend. The part where she tried to locate the version of herself that had existed before the events that had produced the current version. The version that had laughed easily and had opinions about things she expressed without being asked, and that had not yet learned to ration herself so carefully. She could find that version still, in the way you found things that had been packed away. Present, intact, but requiring specific effort to access and not available at a moment's notice the way it had once been available. She had grown up in a small town in Kansas called Millhaven. The middle child of a farming family that was decent and warm, and that had given her the specific childhood of someone who has been loved without being particularly focused on. Who has been seen in the general way of families that are busy with the collective project of survival, and who love their children through the quality of the life they provide rather than through sustained individual attention. She had been happy in Millhaven in the specific uncomplicated way of children who have enough, and who have not yet encountered the particular difficulties that the world reserves for later. And she had been good at school and had read voraciously, and had been told by her teacher in her 15th year that she was one of the brightest students she had taught in 2 decades. Which was the kind of thing that produced in a girl from a farming family in Kansas in the 1870s, not a clear path forward but a specific bittersweet awareness that the path available to her was not necessarily the path that the brightness warranted. She had met Thomas Cross when she was 21, at a social gathering in the county seat that she had attended with her older sister. He was 27, a carpenter who was building his own small business in the county seat, with the specific confidence of someone who had a plan and believed in the plan, and who was, in the early months of their acquaintance, almost impossible to find fault with. He was handsome in the easy way of men who have always known they were handsome, and who have made a thorough peace with the knowledge He was charming in the specific way of men who understood social situations and who moved through them with a fluency that was not performance but genuine aptitude. And he had focused on Willa with an attentiveness that she had found. At 21 and accustomed to being the middle child who was loved, but not particularly focused on. Genuinely overwhelming in the best sense of that word. They had married within the year. She had gone with him to the larger town of Grover's Mill, where his carpentry business was established, with the hope of a young woman who had made what felt like the right decision and who was moving toward the life that the decision would produce with the complete commitment of someone who did not do things halfway. The first 2 years had been genuinely good. The business had grown. They had found their rhythm as a household. And she had been happy in the specific way of someone who had made a good choice and who was living inside the results of it with the full engagement that a good choice deserved. Iris had arrived in the 3rd year, small and dark-haired and immediately the organizing center of everything, and Willa had found in the specific absorbed joy of early motherhood. A version of herself that she had not known was available, a version that had a particular quality of completeness that the previous versions had not quite had. Thomas had been a good father in the distracted way of men for whom fatherhood was real, but secondary to the work, genuinely warm with Iris, in the moments when the work permitted the warmth. And the moments had been sufficient, and the household had been happy. And she had not been paying the specific quality of attention to the business's financial situation that she would have paid if she had known there was something to attend to. Thomas had died in the spring of the previous year. A fall from scaffolding. Quick, the doctor said, and she held to that because the alternative was something she could not carry alongside everything else she was carrying. He had been 31. Iris had been 3. Willa had been 25. And she had sat in the house they had shared for 4 years in the specific quiet of the afternoon after, and had felt the full weight of what had just happened arrive in her with the complete force of something that had been theoretical until this moment, and was now entirely actual. Was the actual shape of her life going forward, and the actual shape was considerably different from the shape she had been living in. The debts had arrived with the letter from the bank in Grover's Mill 2 weeks after the funeral, the specific letter that revealed what she had not known, which was that Thomas's carpentry business had been operating, for the better part of the previous year, on borrowed money secured against assets she had believed were clear of encumbrance. The amount was not catastrophic in the abstract, but in the specific context of a widow with a 3-year-old daughter and no income, and no particular skill set beyond the fine sewing that her mother had taught her, and the intelligence that her teacher had praised, and that had not been directed toward anything practical. The amount was the difference between staying in Grover's Mill and not being able to stay in Grover's Mill. She had sold the house and the business tools and the furniture that was hers to sell. She had settled what could be settled, and had arranged what could be arranged. And she had arrived at the specific accounting of a woman who has cleared what was clearable, and who has, on the other side of the clearing, considerably less than she started with, and a 4-year-old daughter and a sewing kit, and the particular focused determination of someone who has looked at the available options, and has decided on one of them, and intends to execute it with everything she has. She had chosen Cedar Bend for the same reasons that people chose small frontier towns when they needed a place that would not already know their story. The county paper had advertised it as a growing community with a need for skilled tradespeople, and a skilled seamstress with a reputation for fine work was a tradesperson. And the growing community part meant that there would be enough work to sustain her, if she was good enough and consistent enough, and could establish herself before the capital she was bringing ran out. She had arrived in May, with Iris and the sewing kit and the specific determination, and she had rented the rooms from Mrs. Daltrey, who had been interested in a seamstress in the rooms above her dress shop for practical commercial reasons and who had been willing to accommodate a child without making it a significant social negotiation. And she had set up the sewing work and had begun the process of establishing herself in Cedar Bend with the focused, systematic competence that was her primary available mode of engagement with the world. The work had grown as she had calculated it would, through the summer and into the fall, and she had been managing the accounts with the specific precision of someone for whom the margin was narrow enough. That precision was not optional. Paying the rent and buying the food and putting aside what could be put aside against the months when the work would be lighter or the expenses heavier. She had been managing it. She had been managing it correctly. in the sense that every month the accounts had balanced and the rent had been paid, and Iris had been fed and clothed, and the debt had been slowly reducing from the capital she had arrived with. And then January had arrived with the specific severity of a Wyoming winter that had decided to be fully itself. And Iris had developed the chest cough on the 6th of the month. And the doctor had come on the 7th and had told her what Iris needed. And the medicine had cost what the medicine cost. And the accounting that she had been managing with such careful precision had produced, for the first time in 8 months, a number that did not work. She had been doing the arithmetic for 2 weeks. Every morning she had arranged the numbers differently, looking for the configuration that would make them work. And every morning the numbers had declined to be arranged in the way she needed them to be arranged. And every morning she had told herself she would find a way, and had gone back to the sewing with the specific focused determination that was the only tool she had left for the situation. Working longer hours and taking on more pieces and doing everything that could be done with the resources available, which were her hands and her skill in the hours in the day. And the hours in the day were the constraint that could not be worked around. She had run out of mornings. This was the morning. This was the counter of Greer's General Store. These were the coins in her hand. This was the medicine in front of her. And this was the arithmetic that did not work, and would not work no matter how many times she arranged it. She had been standing at the counter for 30 seconds longer than the situation warranted. And the 30 seconds had been the specific 30 seconds of someone reaching the end of what they have available to reach. And the reaching the end had produced the thing she had not cried in 8 months. And that was going to happen now, regardless of whether she had made any decision about allowing it. She had not made any decision about allowing it. She cried anyway. And that was where August Ward found her. At the end of the arithmetic. At the end of the 8 months. At the specific point of convergence where the focused determination that had been keeping everything together for longer than it was designed to keep everything together had finally, in the fluorescent light of Greer's General Store on a Tuesday morning in January 1883, reached the limit of what determination alone could do. She did not know, standing there with the coins in her hand and the tears on her face, that the limit was not the end of the story. She only knew that it was the end of the arithmetic. She had not yet met the man who was about to show her that some problems did not require solving alone, and that the solving of them together was not the surrender she had been afraid it was, but the beginning of the specific kind of strength that was not available to someone managing alone, no matter how good they were at the managing. She was very good at the managing. She was about to find out what was on the other side of it. There are men who take up space in the way that weather takes up space, not aggressively, not with any particular intention toward the space, but completely in the way of something that is simply present, and that the environment organizes itself around, without being asked to and without the thing itself doing anything to produce the organizing. August Ward was that kind of man, and the town of Cedar Bend had been organizing itself around his monthly presence for 3 years without particularly thinking about it. In the specific way that small communities absorbed their reliable constants into the background of their daily life and stopped registering them as remarkable. He had been born in western Nebraska, the only child of a ranching family that had worked the same difficult land for 1 generation and that had been working it long enough to understand it in the specific deep way that came from sustained attention rather than from the abstract study of it. His father had been a man of enormous capability and almost no language, who had communicated everything that mattered through the quality of what he did and through the specific quality of his presence, which was the presence of someone entirely committed to what was in front of him at all times, and never anywhere else. And his mother had been a woman of sharp intelligence and dry humor, who had understood her son's particular quality from early on and had given it, in the specific generous way of women who understood what they were looking at, the gift of her recognition. He had been large since adolescence. Large in the way that required the specific management of someone who understood early that his dimensions preceded him into rooms, and that the impression they made was not always accurate, and that the most reliable correction was not explanation but behavior. He had spent 35 years refining the behavior into something that was no longer management, but simply who he was, the deliberate quietness, the unhurried movements, the specific careful way he occupied space in other people's presence that communicated without words. That his size was not a threat, and was not an imposition, but was simply a fact of the environment, that he had taken responsibility for managing, so that no one else had to. The people who knew him well understood the quietness as the specific quality of someone for whom observation was the primary mode of engagement with the world, and for whom speaking was a resource to be spent carefully. People who did not know him well tended to find him unreadable, which he had long since accepted as the price of being someone who did not perform his interiority for an audience. He had come to Cedar Bend 3 years ago, having spent the previous decade ranging through Wyoming and Colorado working various ranch operations and accumulating the specific practical knowledge of someone who had been paying close attention to the land and the animals and the work across multiple contexts and who had arrived, by the time he purchased the ward spread 12 miles outside Cedar Bend, at a thorough understanding of what the work required and a thorough confidence in his ability to provide it. The ward spread was not the largest operation in the valley. It was the most consistently managed, the most reliable in the specific way of things that were built to last rather than to impress. And the community had absorbed this quality into its understanding of August Ward in the same way it absorbed everything about him, which was without particular ceremony and with the specific practical respect that frontier communities gave to things that worked. He came to town on the first Tuesday of every month. Not because the first Tuesday was functionally different from any other day of the month, but because the habit of a specific day had proven, across his working life, to be the most efficient way to manage the monthly supply requirements of a ranch operation. The specific day meant the specific list, and the specific list meant nothing was forgotten, and nothing was purchased twice, and the efficiency of it meant that the time in town was the minimum necessary, rather than longer, which suited him. Because Cedar Bend was a decent town, but he was not a man who found the social architecture of small towns particularly nourishing, and he had long since stopped pretending otherwise. He had noticed Willa Cross in her second week in Cedar Bend, which was June of the previous year, which was 7 months before the January morning in Greer's general store. And he had noticed her in the specific comprehensive way that was his characteristic quality, which was without agenda and without anything attached to the noticing except the noticing itself. He had been in the hardware section of Greer's when she had come in with a small dark-haired child on her hip, and the specific quality of someone doing an unfamiliar errand in an unfamiliar place, with the focused attention of someone who could not afford to do it wrong. And he had registered her with the specific comprehensive attention he gave to most things. And what he had registered had settled in him with the specific weight of a thing that would be returned to, rather than filed and forgotten. She was strikingly beautiful in the way he found most striking, which was the beauty that was entirely unaware of itself, that was present without being performed, that existed as simply a fact about her face, rather than something she was doing with it. The dark blue eyes that were large and expressive, and that she was clearly working to keep from expressing what they actually contained. The dark brown hair with the chestnut warmth of it visible, even in the practical low bun she wore it in. The fine bones of her face and the specific quality of her slightness, which was not fragility, but the specific slightness of someone whose frame had been refined by the kind of sustained effort that left no remaining excess. She was wearing dark colors, and she was moving with the specific efficiency of someone who had organized their movements around getting things done rather than around being seen. And she was carrying the small child with the automatic ease of long practice. He had noted these things and had continued with his own errands and had ridden back to the ward spread at the end of the day with the specific equanimity of a man who had observed something he found significant, and who was not in the habit of acting on observations before they had been fully processed. He had processed it over the following months in the way he processed most things, which was slowly and completely, and without rushing the processing. And what the processing had produced was not a plan or an intention, but simply a clear-eyed understanding of the specific situation of a woman who was managing something that required more than she was likely to have available, and who was doing it with a quality of competent determination that was genuinely impressive, and that was also, to someone paying the right kind of attention, clearly running on reserves that were not inexhaustible. He had watched her across the 7 monthly visits to Cedar Bend with the specific peripheral attention he had developed for things he was not in a position to engage with directly. Noting the evidence of the sewing work in the way the women of Cedar Bend talked about her work when he was in proximity to those conversations. Noting the specific quality of her bearing in the times he saw her on the main street. which was the bearing of someone who was holding themselves together by the force of a discipline that was beginning to show its cost, noting the child, who was small and lively and clearly the organizing center of everything her mother did. He had not spoken to her in 7 months. Not because she was not worth speaking to, which she clearly was, not because he had no reason, which he did not. Or rather because the reasons he had were not the kind that presented themselves as legitimate social entry points in the specific way that frontier social convention recognized and validated. He was not her neighbor. He was not her customer. He was not connected to her through any of the social structures that would have given a single man in a small town a legitimate basis for approaching a widow who had made it clear, through the consistent architecture of her public behavior, that she was not currently accepting social overtures from anyone. He had understood this and had maintained his distance with the specific patience of a man who did not require things to happen on his schedule. The first Tuesday of January arrived with the specific severity of a Wyoming January that had decided to be fully itself. The kind of cold that was not the cold of discomfort, but the cold of the land's fundamental nature asserting itself against the pretensions of the warm months. Clear and bright and absolutely committed to its temperature. He had ridden the 12 miles in it with the uncomplaining pragmatism of someone for whom this weather was simply the condition of the first Tuesday of January, and who had dressed for it accordingly. And he had arrived at Cedar Bend at his usual hour, and had tied his horse at the usual post, and had gone to Greer's with the monthly list. He had been in the back section of the store when he heard her at the counter. Not the words initially. The store was large enough that the counter conversation did not carry to the back section as distinct words, but the quality of the silence that followed whatever had been said at the counter. The specific quality of a silence that had something in it that was different from the ordinary transactional silence of a purchase. The quality that told him, with the specific certainty of someone who had been paying attention to the world for 35 years, and who knew what that particular quality of silence meant, that something was happening at the counter that was not ordinary. He had moved toward the counter with the deliberate, unhurried quality of his movements, not rushing, not making a production of the moving, simply redirecting his path in that direction because the redirection was indicated. He had come around the end of the last aisle, and he had seen her standing at the counter with the coins in her hand, and the medicine on the counter, and the specific quality of someone who has reached the end of the arithmetic. And then he had seen the tears, which were not dramatic, and were not the tears of someone performing distress, but the specific involuntary tears of someone whose composure had finally exceeded its capacity. Had given way not because she had allowed it to, but because the 8 months of not allowing it had finally produced, in this specific moment, a failure of the mechanism. He had understood the situation in the time it took to cross the remaining distance to the counter. The understanding was not complicated, and did not require analysis. Because the coins and the medicine, the tears and the specific configuration he was looking at, added up to exactly one thing, which was a woman who could not afford the medicine for a sick child, and who was experiencing in this specific public moment the full weight of that arithmetic. He had understood this, and he had reached past her and put the coins on the counter, the specific amount which he had assessed in the same moment he assessed everything else, drawn from the supply money in his coat pocket, without counting because the counting was not necessary. He could read the amount from the configuration of what was on the counter, and what was in her hand, and he was precise about these things. She had turned to refuse. He had expected this, had known. From 7 months of observing a woman who managed alone with a quality of pride that was not vanity, but the specific pride of someone for whom their own capability was the thing that stood between them and a vulnerability they could not afford, that the refusal would come. He had looked at her with the dark green eyes, and he had not flinched from the looking, and he had not softened it with the particular quality of pity that she had been bracing for. Because pity was not what he felt, and performing it would have been dishonest, and he was not a man who performed things he did not feel. What he felt was something considerably more specific than pity. It was the specific recognition of a woman at the end of 8 months of managing alone, which was a thing he recognized because he had managed alone for a long time himself. And he knew what the end of that looked like from the outside. And he felt the specific clarity of someone who had observed a situation long enough to understand exactly what it required and who was now in a position to provide it. He said, "Don't apologize for crying." He said it in the voice he used for the things that required saying plainly, low and even, and without the performance of gentleness, because the gentleness was real and did not require performance. He said it and he held her gaze for the moment that the saying required, and then he turned back to the counter and completed the transaction with the specific, unhurried quality of someone for whom what had just happened was simply a practical matter that had required a practical response. Because making it into something larger than that would have required her to manage a larger thing, and she had enough to manage. He did not know her name. He knew her face. He knew the quality of the dark blue eyes at close range, which was considerably more than the peripheral impression of 7 monthly visits had allowed him to see. He knew the specific quality of the gratitude and the resistance and the exhaustion and the something else that was in those eyes in the moment she looked at him. He knew all of this in the specific, comprehensive way that was his characteristic mode of knowing things. And he turned back to his own list and let her collect the medicine and collect herself and leave, because leaving was what she needed to be able to do, and making her stay to receive something more than the 4 words he had said would have been about him rather than about her. He finished his list. He paid for his supplies. He walked out into the January cold and loaded the wagon and stood for a moment in the specific bright cold of a Wyoming winter morning, looking at nothing in particular, with the patient quality of his default expression. And he thought about the dark blue eyes at close range, and the 8 months of observing a woman manage alone, and the specific weight of what the morning had been. And he thought about the next first Tuesday of February and what it would look like, and whether the morning had changed the specific social geometry of Cedar Bend in a way that would make the February Tuesday different from the previous 7. He thought it probably had. He was not wrong. She did not go home immediately. She stood outside Greer's general store in the January, cold with the medicine in her hands and the specific quality of someone who has just been through something in a public space and who needs a moment before they can re-enter the world in the functional mode that the world required of them. The cold helped. It was the specific sharp cold of a Wyoming January morning that pressed against the skin with an honesty that was almost clarifying, that made the interior weather feel less singular because the exterior weather was equally uncompromising. And she stood in it for the length of time she needed, and then she walked back to the rooms above Mrs. Daltrey's dress shop with the medicine and the specific careful quality of someone who has been seen at a moment they did not choose to be seen, and who is still in the process of determining what that means. She gave Iris the first dose of the medicine at mid-morning, measuring it carefully with the dropper the pharmacist had included, holding Iris in her lap while the child took it with the specific cooperative patient quality of a sick 4-year-old who had learned that the bitter things generally helped, and feeling the specific complicated mixture of relief and something else that she did not have a clean name for. Sitting in the rented rooms with the medicine that she had not been able to pay for, and that she now had anyway, because a man she had never spoken to had reached past her and put the money on the counter, and had said 4 words that she had been turning over in her mind since the moment he said them. Don't apologize for crying. Not, it is all right. Not, please don't worry about it. Not the particular social reassurance that she had been bracing against. The reassurance that would have required her to receive it with the managed grace of someone accepting a charity they were not certain they had earned. Simply, don't apologize for crying. Which was not a reassurance at all, but a specific instruction delivered with the plain directness of someone who meant it entirely. And the difference between the reassurance she had been braced for and the instruction she had received was the difference between being managed and being seen. And she had not been seen in that specific way in a very long time, and the specific quality of it was something she was going to need more than a morning to process fully. She did not know his name. She knew his face at close range, which was considerably more than she had allowed herself to register in the 7 months they had been in the same town. The dark green eyes that were patient in a way that was different from the patience of someone waiting for something, and more like the patience of someone who was simply present and who did not require things to be different from what they were. The square jaw with the short dark beard that had gray in it, at the jaw in the specific way of men who had been through enough to show it, the size of him, which at the distance of a counter was a different fact than it was at the distance of a street, was the specific fact of a very large man who was managing the size with a deliberate quietness that communicated something she had received before she had consciously identified it, which was that the size was not directed at her, and was not a threat, and was entirely under a control that she did not need to monitor. She did not know what to do with any of this. She put it in the interior place where she put things that required processing she did not currently have the resources for, and she went back to the sewing work, and she told herself that processing could wait. The processing did not wait. It presented itself, at various points across the rest of the day and into the evening, with the specific insistence of something that has been handled directly, and that is not willing to be redirected to the processing queue. She thought about him while she hemmed the skirt that Mrs. Fletcher had brought in on Monday. She thought about him while she put Iris to bed. The child's breathing somewhat easier than it had been the previous 3 nights. The medicine beginning its work. She thought about him while she sat at the work table in the specific quiet of the rooms after Iris was asleep, with the lamp burning and the January cold pressing against the window. And she thought about what it meant that he had not made it into something she had to manage. She had been managing things for 8 months. Every interaction with the world had been something she managed. Managed to be sufficient without being needy. Managed to be competent without inviting the particular condescension of people who saw a young widow alone and concluded from the alone that she required direction. Managed to maintain the specific social position of someone who was a legitimate participant in the community rather than a charity case. The managing had been necessary, and she had been good at it. And it had cost her something she had not been adding up. Because the adding up of it would have produced a number she was not ready to look at. The man in the general store had not required her to manage anything. He had done the thing, and said the 4 words and turned back to the counter. And she had been left holding the medicine and the tears and the specific quality of something that had been given without cost attached. Which was a thing she had not been given in 8 months, and that she had not understood she had been missing until the missing was suddenly not there. She went to Greer's the following Thursday. Not to see him. She told herself firmly and specifically that she was not going to Greer's to see him, because she had a practical need for thread that Mrs. Daltrey's supply had run short of, and because Greer's was the only general store in Cedar Bend, and going there was simply the practical action the situation required. She went on Thursday, because Thursday was when she usually went. His schedule, which she now understood was the first Tuesday of every month, was not a factor in her going on Thursday, which was not the first Tuesday of any month. He was there. He was in the fabric section when she came in, which was not a place she would have expected to find him. And he was holding a bolt of practical dark wool with the specific focused attention of someone who was assessing its quality for a genuine purpose rather than browsing. And he looked up when she entered, with the dark green eyes, and the specific unhurried quality of his attention. And he said, in the low even voice, "How is the child?" She stopped. The question had arrived before she had arranged herself for a conversation, which was perhaps why her response to it was not the managed version, but something closer to the actual one. She said, "Better." She said, "The medicine is working." He said, "Good." He said it with the same quality he had said the 4 words, which was the quality of someone for whom the word contained everything it needed to contain, and did not require elaboration. She said, "I don't know your name." He said, "August Ward." She said, "Willa Cross." He said, "I know." She said, "How do you know?" He said, "Cedar Bend is a small town." He said it without elaboration, and she understood that the elaboration was not necessary. He knew her name because he had been paying attention. And the paying attention was simply his mode of engaging with the world, and she was part of the world he had been engaging with. She said, "I want to pay you back." He said, "No." She said, "I want to." He said, "I know you do." He said, "Keep the money for something else." She said, "Mr. Ward." He said, "August." He said it not as an invitation to familiarity, but as the specific correction of a man who preferred his first name to his last in direct conversation, delivered without social pressure. Simply as information. She said, "August." She said, "I don't accept things I haven't earned." He said, "You earned it." she said. How? He said. By being in the situation you were in and not pretending you weren't. She looked at him across the fabric section of Greer's general store, and he looked back at her with the dark green eyes, and neither of them said anything for a moment that had more inside it than the available silence should have been able to hold. She said, "That is a very specific way to think about earning something." He said, "I'm a specific person." She said, "So I've been told." He looked at her. She said, "I mean..." She stopped. She said, "No one has told me that. I don't know you." He said, "No." He said, "You don't." A pause. He said, "Yet." The word arrived with the same plain quality as everything else he said, without the social performance of an invitation. Simply as a statement of what he believed to be true about the current situation, and she received it with the careful attention she gave to things that required careful attention. The forced proximity arrived through the specific channel that forced proximity tended to arrive through in small frontier towns, which was through the practical architecture of the community's social and commercial life. Mrs. Daltrey, who was Willa's landlord, and whose dress shop occupied the ground floor of the building where Willa rented her rooms, was also the person who made and repaired the majority of the soft furnishings for the ranches in the valley, and the Ward Ranch, 12 miles outside Cedar Bend. Had a standing order with Mrs. Daltrey for curtains and bedding that had been in place since August Ward had purchased the spread 3 years ago. Mrs. Daltrey, who was 71, and whose eyesight had been deteriorating for the better part of 2 years, and who had been managing this with the creative accounting of someone who was not ready to admit the deterioration, but who had been increasingly relying on Willa's sewing without formally acknowledging the reliance, came to Willa on the Friday after the general store encounter with a commission. The Ward Ranch needed new curtains for the main house, specific curtains, Mrs. Daltrey said, that required measurement at the property because the windows were non-standard sizes and the measurements needed to be taken on site. Mrs. Daltrey had always done the measurements herself. In the previous years, Mrs. Daltrey's eyesight, which she was still not formally acknowledging as a problem, had produced, in the previous year's curtain commission for the Harwick Ranch, a set of curtains that had been 6 inches short on 3 of the 4 windows. A discrepancy that had been managed with the addition of a border that Mrs. Daltrey had presented as a design choice, and that Willa had sewn with the specific diplomatic competence of someone who understood what she was looking at, and who understood equally that the most useful thing she could do was execute the solution without commentary on the problem. The Ward Commission required measurements. Mrs. Daltrey's eyes required that someone else take the measurements, and Willa was the someone else. She went on a Monday morning in the 3rd week of January, riding out the 12 miles in the cold with the measurement kit and the specific quality of someone who was doing a professional task that happened to be bringing her into contact with a situation she had not yet fully processed. The ward spread was visible from the road for the last mile of the approach, which was enough time to register the specific quality of it. Not the largest in the valley, but managed with the particular thoroughness of someone for whom every detail of the operation was a reflection of a standard he held himself to whether or not anyone else was measuring. The fences were in good repair, the barn was well maintained. The main house was modest by the standards of the valley's more prosperous operations, and entirely adequate by any practical measure. And it had the specific quality of a house that was lived in by someone who cared about it without needing it to be impressive. He was in the yard when she arrived, moving between the barn and the fence line with the unhurried deliberateness of his characteristic movements. And he stopped when he saw her, and waited with the patient quality of someone who had expected her, because Mrs. Daltrey had presumably communicated the arrangement. Though the specific quality of the waiting suggested he would have stopped and waited in exactly the same way regardless of whether he had been expecting her or not. He said, "Mrs. Cross." She said, "August." He looked at her with the dark green eyes. She said, "You corrected me to your first name, so I'm using it." He said, "Fair enough." He said, "Come in." He said it with the same plain quality, not an elaborate welcome, not the social performance of hospitality, simply the practical invitation of someone whose door was open to a person who had come for a practical purpose, and who was making that clear without attaching conditions to it. The inside of the house had the specific quality she had expected from the outside, functional and clean and containing exactly what was necessary, with nothing added for appearance. The main room had a large stone fireplace that was burning with the efficiency of a fire that had been built correctly, and that was doing its job without waste, and the windows, which were indeed non-standard sizes, admitted the January light at an angle that made the room warmer, in the visual sense than the functional temperature strictly warranted. She took the measurements with the professional focus she brought to all practical tasks, measuring twice in each case, noting the specific dimensions in the book she carried for the purpose. Moving through the rooms he indicated with the efficient economy of someone who understood that her time on his property was professional time, and that conducting herself accordingly was the appropriate form of the interaction. He made coffee while she worked. Not with ceremony or social construction. He simply had the pot on the stove, and when she came back to the main room from the last bedroom, he set a cup on the table with the same plain practicality with which he did everything, and said, "It's cold out." She looked at the cup, and she looked at him, and she sat down at the table, because refusing the coffee would have been the managed thing, and she had been thinking, since the general store, about the managed thing and whether the managing was always serving her as well as she believed it was. The coffee was good, strong and clean. The coffee of someone who had been making it for themselves for long enough that they had arrived at the correct ratio without needing to think about it. She said, "The measurements are straightforward." She said, "I can have the curtains ready in 3 weeks if Mrs. Daltrey has the fabric." He said, "She has the fabric." She said, "Then 3 weeks." He said, "That works." He said, "How is Iris?" She said, "Better. Still coughing, but better." He said, "Wyoming winters are hard on small children." She said, "I'm finding that out." He said, "The first one is the hardest." He said it with the specific quality of someone stating a fact from direct knowledge rather than from theory, and she looked at him and said, "You've had children here." He said, "No." He said, "I mean the first winter is the hardest for anyone new to it." He said, "After that, you know what it requires." She said, "What does it require?" He said, "Preparation." He said, and knowing who to ask when the preparation isn't enough. She held that for a moment. She said, "I'm not very good at the asking." He said, "I know." He said it with the same plain quality, and she looked at him across the table with the dark blue eyes that were doing the careful work they had been doing since the general store, which was the work of someone assessing something they were not yet certain how to receive. He met the looking with the same patient green eyes. Neither of them looked away. She said, "You're not going to make this into something I have to manage, are you?" He said, "No." She said, "How do I know that?" He said, "Because I haven't yet." She looked at him. She said, "That's a very short track record." He said, "It's the track record available." He said, "You can extend it or not. The choice is yours." She said, "And if I extend it?" He said, "Then you extend it, and I show up the same way I've been showing up, and you assess accordingly." She said, "And if I don't?" He said, "Then you don't. And I finish the curtains on my next supply run, and that's where it ends." She said, "You make it sound very simple." He said, "It is simple." He said, "It's only not simple if we make it complicated, and I don't have any interest in making it complicated." She looked at him for a long moment in the January light of the Ward Ranch kitchen, with the coffee in her hands and the measurement book on the table and the specific quality of something being offered to her without cost attached. And she thought about the general store and the 4 words and the dark green eyes that had not flinched and that had not offered pity and that had simply been present in the specific way that was. She was beginning to understand, simply how he was present in everything. She said, "The curtains will be ready in 3 weeks." He said, "I'll come for them on the first Tuesday of February." She said, "All right." She stood and put on her coat, and he walked her to the door and held it against the wind with the automatic consideration of a man for whom holding a door was not a social gesture but a practical courtesy. and she went out into the January, cold, and untied her horse and rode back toward Cedar Bend with the measurement book and the coffee warmth still in her hands, and the specific quality of someone who has just been through something that was smaller than the general store and larger than the curtain commission, and that she was going to need some time to understand. She understood, riding back through the cold, that he had not made anything complicated. She also understood that the fact of his not making anything complicated was itself the most complicated thing that had happened to her in 8 months, because what was simple for August Ward, who had been managing alone for a long time and who had arrived at a specific clarity about what he was and what he wanted, was not simple for a woman who had been managing alone for 8 months and who had not yet arrived at any clarity beyond the clarity of the next task and the next morning and the next arithmetic. She was going to have to think about this. She thought about it all the way back to Cedar Bend. She had not finished thinking about it by the time she arrived. The curtains took 2.5 weeks, which was 3 days less than the 3 weeks she had quoted him. Not because she had hurried them, but because the work was straightforward, and because she was very good at it, and because the specific quality of having a clear task with clear parameters and a clear deadline was, in the context of the January that had followed the general store, one of the more reliable organizing structures available to her interior life, which had been considerably less organized than usual since the morning of the first Tuesday. She had been thinking about August Ward with the specific intermittent insistence of something that presented itself at regular intervals regardless of whether she had made any decision about allowing it. She thought about him during the sewing work, which was when she did most of her thinking because the sewing occupied her hands and the part of her attention that processed the immediate sensory requirements of the task and left the rest of her mind available for whatever it wanted to do with itself. And what it wanted to do with itself, in the January that followed, was return repeatedly to the Ward kitchen table, and the dark green eyes and the specific quality of someone who had said that the situation was simple, and had meant it. She thought about him in the evenings when the sewing was done, and Iris was asleep, and the rooms were quiet, and the January dark pressed against the windows with the cold persistence of a season that was committed to itself. And she thought about him in the mornings before Iris woke, in the gray pre-dawn quiet. That was when she did her clearest thinking and her most honest accounting. What she arrived at, across the 2.5 weeks of the curtain work, was not a resolution, but a clearer understanding of the specific quality of what he had offered, which was not romance, and was not charity, and was not the particular social transaction of a man making himself available to a widow who might be persuadable, but something considerably more specific and more honest than any of those things. He had offered presence, the plain, consistent, reliable presence of someone who said what he meant, and meant what he said, and who had been demonstrating this quality since the moment in the general store without requiring her to acknowledge the demonstration or respond to it in any particular way. He had offered it without cost attached, and she was beginning to understand that the without cost attached part was the part that was most difficult for her to receive, because everything she had received in the past 8 months had had a cost attached, even the things that were offered in genuine kindness. Because the cost of the kindness was the specific social positioning it produced, the positioning of someone who was receiving rather than giving, who was needing rather than providing, who was less than rather than sufficient. And August Ward's offer of presence did not produce that positioning, because he had not framed it as charity or as rescue, or as anything that required her to be less than in order for him to be more than. And the absence of that framing was something she did not entirely know what to do with. Iris was better by the end of the first week of February. The cough had reduced to the occasional morning remnant that the doctor had said would persist for another few weeks before clearing completely. And her color was better, and her energy was returning in the specific incremental way of a child, recovering from illness, and she was asking again about the things she asked about when she was well, which were primarily dogs and horses and whether winter would end before she was too old to enjoy the spring, the last of which she phrased as whether the snow would go away before she died, which was the specific 4-year-old's logic that produced in Willa the helpless specific laugh that Iris alone still managed to produce in her. She told August about this on the first Tuesday of February when he came for the curtains. He was at Mrs. Daltrey's at his usual hour, and Mrs. Daltrey, whose eye for these things was considerably sharper than her eye for curtain measurements, had found a reason to be in the back room, when Willa brought the curtains down from the rooms above and had remained in the back room through the entirety of the transaction. Which was not subtle, and which Willa registered with the specific rueful awareness of someone who understood that Mrs. Daltrey was doing exactly what she was doing and who had neither the energy nor the inclination to address it directly. He looked at the curtains with the focused attention he gave to practical things, examining the seams and the hang and the specific quality of the finishing with the eye of someone who understood good work and who was assessing it as such rather than simply accepting delivery. He said, "These are good." She said, "They're curtains." He said, "They're well-made curtains." He said it in the specific plain way that made the distinction meaningful, and she received it with the plain acknowledgement it deserved, which was, "Thank you." He said, "How is Iris?" She said, "Better." She told him about the question of whether winter would end before she died, and he received it with the dark green eyes, and something happened at the corners of his mouth. That was the very early suggestion of a smile, barely visible there, and then contained. And she understood from the containment of it that this was not a man who performed his responses but who had them genuinely, and who managed them with the specific careful quality of someone for whom displaying the interior was a deliberate choice rather than an automatic one. He said, "Does she like horses?" She said, "She talks about horses the way most children talk about imaginary things, as though they are the most real things in the world and also somehow beyond reach." He said, "She can come see the horses at the ward spread sometime." He said it in the same plain way. He offered everything, without the social construction of an invitation or the pressure of an expectation, simply as information that was available to her and that she could do with what she chose. She said she would like that. She said it before the managing part of her could intercept the saying, and it was true, which was why it arrived before the managing part, and she registered the truth of it and did not take it back. The structure of the monthly visits changed after February, not through any explicit arrangement, but through the specific accumulated logic of two people who had established a pattern and who were, in the way that patterns were extending it. He came for supplies on the first Tuesday. He stopped at Mrs. Daltrey's. He and Willa talked for the length of time that the conversation required, which was sometimes 20 minutes and sometimes an hour, depending on what the conversation had to cover and on what Iris contributed, because Iris had begun appearing at the top of the stairs when she heard his voice, with the specific 4-year-old's unerring instinct for the presence of someone who was going to be patient with her questions, and coming down to add her particular quality of direct inquiry to the proceedings. She asked him about the horses on his second February visit, with the focused specificity of someone who had been thinking about the topic since it had been introduced. He answered with the same specificity, telling her about the individual horses at the ward spread with the patient completeness of someone who understood that a 4-year-old's question was as worth answering fully as any other question. And Willa sat across the room with the sewing she had brought down from the rooms, and listened to the specific quality of a large man talking to a small child about horses. And she felt something move through her that was not dramatic, was not named, and that she filed in the interior place for processing later. He brought Iris to see the horses in the last week of February, on a Saturday when the weather was less severe than it had been, and when Iris had been demonstrably well for 2 full weeks, and when the question of whether the horses would still exist before she was too old to see them had been raised again with the patient persistence of a child who understood that the strategy of repetition had served her in the past. Willa came with her, which was the only reasonable arrangement, and which she was aware was what he had intended by the invitation when he offered it, because it was an invitation to both of them through the practical channel of the child's interest. They rode out on the Saturday morning, Iris in front of Willa on the rented horse, and the ward spread received them in the specific quality of a late February morning that was still cold, but that had the first suggestion of the change that was coming. The specific quality of cold that was beginning to know it was temporary, rather than the cold that believed itself permanent. Iris saw the horses and was rendered briefly speechless, which was its own specific variety of communication. He lifted her over the fence rail with the specific easy confidence of a man for whom the lifting of a 4-year-old was an entirely manageable physical event, and who had handled animals and children with the same patient care for long enough that the handling was simply second nature. And Iris accepted the lifting with the total trust of a child who had correctly assessed within approximately 15 seconds of meeting someone whether they were safe. And she was correct. And she stood in the corral with the brown mare that was the gentlest of the ward horses, and she put her small hand on the mare's nose with the specific focused reverence of someone in the presence of a thing that had been imaginary until this moment, and that was now. Suddenly and completely real. Willa watched from the fence rail. He came to stand beside her, not close, not with any quality of approach that required her to acknowledge, simply beside her in the way he was beside her in most contexts, which was with the specific unhurried ease of someone for whom being beside her was a natural fact of the space rather than a statement about the space. He said, "She's not afraid." She said, "She's never been afraid of things she wanted." He said, "That's a good quality to have." She said, "It's terrifying to parent." He said, "I imagine." She said, "You don't have children." He said, "No." She said, "Do you want them?" The question arrived before the managing part could review it for appropriateness, and she registered this and did not take it back. Because taking it back would have been more awkward than the asking, and because she was discovering genuinely curious about the answer. He was quiet for a moment, the specific thoughtful quiet of someone giving a question the honest consideration it deserved, rather than the social consideration of what the questioner wanted to hear. He said, "I wanted what came before the children." He said, "The version of things where there's someone to come home to." He said, "I thought for a long time that the coming home to part would take care of itself, and it didn't. And then I got busy with the spread, and I stopped thinking about it as much." She said, "Do you think about it now?" He said, "Some." He said it with the plain quality that did not elaborate beyond what was being asked. And she looked at him with the dark blue eyes, and he looked at her with the dark green ones, and the something that had been present since the general store was present now, more defined, more specific in its quality, more clearly a thing that was there rather than a thing she was uncertain about. She said, "I don't know how to do this." He said, "Do what?" She said, "Whatever this is." She said, "I haven't been doing any version of this since Thomas died. And I'm not sure I remember how. And I'm not sure the version I remember would be the right version for whatever this is anyway." He said, "Then don't do any version." He said, "Just do this." He said, That's actually here. Not a version of something else." She said, "That sounds very simple." He said, "It is simple." He said, "You keep expecting it not to be." She said, "I've had a complicated year." He said, "I know." He said, "Simple is still available after a complicated year." She said, "You're very certain about these things." He said, "About some things." He said, "This one I'm certain about." She looked at him. She said, "Why this one?" He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Because I've been watching you manage alone for 8 months, and the managing has been impressive, and the managing has also been costing you more than it should. And the thing that I know about situations like that is that they don't get better through more managing." She said, "What did they get better through?" He said, "Through having someone to manage alongside." He said it simply, and with the complete quality of someone who had thought about this and had arrived at the honest version of it, rather than the version that would have been more impressive or more eloquent. And she received it with the specific quality of attention she gave to things that required the full weight of her reception. Iris called from the corral. The specific call of a 4-year-old who had discovered something of urgent importance about a horse, and who required a witness for the discovery. They both looked at her, both watching the small dark-haired figure in the corral with the brown mare. And the watching of her together had a quality that neither of them commented on, and that was present regardless of the commenting. The specific quality of two people looking at the same thing from the same place and finding the thing equally important. He said, still watching Iris, "She's going to want to come back." She said, "I know." He said, "The mare is gentle with children." He said, "She can come back." She said, "August." He said, "Yes." She said, "I'm going to be bad at this for a while." He said, "I know." She said. I'm telling you in advance, so it's not a surprise. He said. It's not a surprise. She said. How is it not a surprise? He said. Because I've been paying attention for 8 months. He said. I know what you're working with. He said. I'm not expecting you to be good at it immediately. He said. I'm expecting you to be honest about it, which you are being. She said. That's a low bar. He said. It's the right bar. He said. The other bars are for later. She looked at him with the dark blue eyes and he looked at her with the dark green ones, and Iris called from the corral again about the urgent horse development, and they both turned toward her. Together, in the specific easy way of two people who had not planned the togetherness, but who were both already in it. The March visits were different from the February ones in the specific incremental way that things changed when a small but genuine change had been introduced. He still came on the first Tuesday. He still stopped at Mrs. Daltrey's. But the conversations were different in their quality. Less the careful exchange of two people managing the specific social geometry of a new acquaintance, and more the natural exchange of two people who had established enough mutual knowledge to speak from it, rather than across it. She told him about the sewing work, about the specific pieces she was working on, and the particular challenges of the current commission, which was an elaborate evening dress for the Waverly daughter who was getting married in May, and whose ideas about the dress significantly exceeded the practicality of execution, but who was paying well enough that the execution was worth the challenge. He listened with the full attention he gave to things she said. And he asked the questions that told her he had understood what she was describing, and was interested in the specifics, rather than the general category. He told her about the ranch in March, about the specific work of the early spring, which was the work of assessment after the winter, of finding what had held and what had not and addressing the things that had not, with the systematic competence of someone who had been through this season enough times that the surprises were fewer and the responses were more practiced. She listened and asked questions that showed she understood the general principles even when she did not know the specific technical details. And he answered those questions with the same patient completeness he gave to Iris's questions about horses. Without condescension and without the particular quality of someone who enjoyed their own expertise for its own sake, simply sharing information with someone who was interested in having it. Iris asked him, in March, whether he was going to keep coming to see them. He and Willa were both in the room when she asked. Iris was sitting on the floor with the wooden horse he had brought her on the February Saturday visit, which had been produced from his coat pocket with the same plain practicality with which he produced everything. And she looked up from the horse with the direct, unapologetic inquiry that was her characteristic mode of engagement with the world. He looked at Iris and then at Willa and then back at Iris. He said, "Yes." He said it with the same plain quality, and Iris said, "Good," and went back to the wooden horse. And Willa looked at the floor for a moment with the dark blue eyes, and then looked up and found him looking at her with the dark green ones, and the something that had been present since the general store was more present now than it had ever been. And she held it, and did not look away. She was getting better at the not looking away. April arrived in Cedar Bend with the specific quality of a Wyoming spring that had been negotiated through the length of the winter, and that was arriving now with the cautious increment of something that understood it was not yet permanent, but that was genuinely present in the south-facing slopes where the snow had been thinning since the third week of March, and in the quality of the afternoon light that was beginning to carry a warmth in it, that the January and February light had entirely declined to offer. Willa noticed it, in the way she had been noticing things since February, which was with more of her actual attention than she had been directing at the world, in the 8 months before that. The noticing of someone who had been managing her engagement with the world at the minimum necessary, and who was in the incremental way of things returning rather than things arriving. Beginning to direct more of herself at the available experience of being alive in a specific place, at a specific time with specific things to attend to. She attributed this to many things, to Iris's recovery, which had completed itself by the middle of February and which had relieved the specific sustained anxiety of the sick child period in a way that released interior resources she had not realized had been entirely allocated to the anxiety. To the sewing work, which was going well in the specific way that mattered, which was that it was sufficient and consistent, and that the accounting that she did every week was producing numbers that were no longer running on the edge of inadequate, and to August Ward, whom she attributed this to last, not because his contribution was smallest, but because naming it felt like a commitment to the naming that she was still. In the April that had followed the February visit to the horses and the March that had followed, in the process of determining whether she was ready to make. She was talking to him more honestly in April than she had been talking to anyone about anything since before Thomas died. Not because she had made a decision to be more honest, but in the specific way that honesty arrived when the conditions for it were correct. When the person you were talking to received what you offered without converting it into something that required you to manage the receiving. And when the receiving had been consistent enough over enough time that you had accumulated actual evidence of its reliability rather than simply the theoretical belief that it might be reliable. She had the evidence. She had been accumulating it since the general store in January, and the accumulation had produced, by April, something that was beginning to look, from the inside, like trust. Which was a category she had not been accepting applications for, and that had apparently applied through the channel of dark green eyes, and the specific plain quality of a man who said what he meant. She told him about Thomas in April, not all of it. Not the full, complicated interior accounting of the marriage and its aftermath, but the parts that were ready to be told. The parts that had been waiting for a listener who was capable of receiving the complexity rather than needing it simplified. She told him about the specific quality of the marriage's good years, which had been genuinely good in ways she was not willing to reduce simply because the later years had been harder. And she told him about the later years with the specific plain honesty she had been working toward. About a particular way that Thomas's relationship with the carpentry business had been the organizing principle of his interior life in a way that had left insufficient room for the other organizing principles that a marriage required. And about the way she had managed this. In the way she managed everything. By adjusting and continuing and not naming the adjustment as a loss, because naming it would have required her to address it, and addressing it had felt more dangerous than the managing. He listened with the complete quality, not performing the listening. Not producing the expressions that would have told her he was monitoring her emotional state and preparing his responses accordingly. Simply receiving what she offered with the full weight of his attention and asking the questions that told her he had understood what she was saying and was interested in the thing beneath the content. He said, when she had described the specific quality of the later years, that the kind of loneliness she was describing was the kind that did not have a clean shape. The loneliness of being with someone and being unseen by them, which was different from the loneliness of being alone, and was in some ways harder, because it had no legitimate form of acknowledgement. She said, that is exact. She said it with the quality of someone who has spent a long time trying to find the language for something, and has just heard someone else produce it. And he received the quality of what she said with the same completeness. She asked him about his own marriage, or the absence of it. Not with the social probing of someone collecting information, but with the genuine curiosity of someone who had been told that he had wanted the coming home to part, and had been told it had not taken care of itself, and who was interested in the specific truth of that. He said, I was 24, and I was wrong about what I was ready for. He said, I thought being ready to work hard and being ready to be present were the same thing, and they weren't. He said, I was ready to work hard, and I was not ready to be present. And the person I was with needed the presence more than the hard work, and I couldn't provide what she needed, and she found someone who could. He said it with the specific matter-of-fact quality of someone who had processed this a long time ago, and was reporting the result, rather than performing the processing. And she received it with the care it deserved. Which was the care of someone who understood that a man telling you a true thing about himself was offering you something specific, and that the specific something deserved to be received specifically. She said. And now, he said. Now I know the difference. She said. Between the work and the presence. He said. Yes. She said. How do you know you know? She said. Because the work is the same. He said. The work has been the same for 11 years, and I have not been more ready for it, or less ready for it at any point in those 11 years. He said. But the presence is different. He said. I know what being present costs, and I know what it produces, and I am more ready for it now than I was at 24. She said. How much more ready? He said. Entirely more ready. He said it with the plain directness that was his characteristic mode. And she looked at him across the April afternoon, and the something that had been present since January was the most present it had been. Was the specific quality of something that had arrived and was not moving, and was simply there, waiting for her to decide what she was going to do with it. The deepening had a quality she had not expected, which was the quality of something that was making her stronger rather than making her dependent. The specific quality of an interior surplus that was building across the April weeks as a direct result of not managing everything alone. Of having someone to say the things to that she had been keeping interior for 8 months. Of the specific relief of being received completely by someone who did not require her to be less complicated than she was. She was working better. The sewing work was better in April than it had been in any previous month, which she understood as the evidence of interior surplus expressing itself through the work. The way a plant grew better when the specific conditions it required were met. She was present with Iris in a more complete way, not just functionally present, which she had been throughout, but present in the way of someone who had enough interior surplus to actually inhabit the moments with her daughter, rather than simply executing them correctly. She thought about this on an April evening while Iris slept. Sitting at the work table with the Waverly wedding dress spread across the surface, and the April dark outside the window, and the lamp burning its steady amber. And she allowed herself to think about August Ward with the full attention, rather than the managing attention, allowed herself to understand, without the qualification she had been applying to the understanding, that what was happening was something she had not chosen, and had not arranged for, and that was genuine. And that the genuine was not something she was going to be able to continue managing from a distance much longer without the management becoming dishonest. The darkest moment arrived on the second Friday of April, through the specific channel that darkest moments arrived in small frontier towns, which was through the opinions of people who had observed something and had decided they had a responsibility to share what they had observed with the person they believed needed to hear it. It arrived in the form of Mrs. Greer, the wife of the general store owner, a woman of genuine warmth and considerable social influence in Cedar Bend, who was also the woman who had been at the counter on the first Tuesday of January when August Ward had paid for Iris's medicine, and who had therefore been in possession of specific information about the situation since before the situation had fully developed, and who had, across the months, accumulated additional specific information through the general observation that small towns conducted as a matter of routine social maintenance. Mrs. Greer came to Mrs. Daltrey's on a Friday afternoon with a genuine piece of sewing business, a hem that required taking up on a dress she had brought in 6 weeks ago and that had not yet been attended to. Willa was in the front room when she arrived and completed the hem while Mrs. Greer waited, in the specific efficient way of a professional who understood that a customer's time was the currency of the transaction, and who did not extend the task beyond what the task required. When she was done, she gave Mrs. Greer the dress, and Mrs. Greer took it and held it and said, with the warm purposefulness of a woman who had decided that her relationship with the truth required her to say something, "Willa, I want to say something to you, and I hope you'll take it in the spirit it's intended." She said what she had come to say. She said it with the complete sincerity of someone for whom the community's well-being was a genuine concern, and who had concluded that what she was about to say was in the community's, and in Willa's, specific interests. She said, "People are noticing the Wardman's visits, and people are forming opinions about them. And I know you've worked very hard since you came here to establish yourself as someone of good standing. And I would hate for that to be complicated by a situation that hasn't been formalized in the way the community would expect it to be formalized, if it is what it appears to be." She said, "I'm saying this because I respect you, and because I want you to know what's being said, so you can make informed decisions about what you want to do." She said all of this with complete sincerity and complete warmth and without any malice. And Willa received it with the composed grace that was her mode in situations she had not arranged, and that required management. And she thanked Mrs. Greer and said she appreciated the concern. And she saw her to the door, and closed the door, and stood in the front room of Mrs. Daltrey's dress shop for a moment, in the specific quality of stillness that was different from her usual stillness. She went upstairs. Iris was asleep, the afternoon sleep that she still took at 4, curled in the specific small shape of a sleeping child with the wooden horse from the Ward Ranch held loosely in her hand. Willa sat at the work table and she did not pick up the sewing and she did not immediately do the thing that her instinct told her to do, which was to begin the specific process of reducing and managing and reorganizing the situation into something that minimized the social exposure and maximized the protection of the standing she had worked to build. She sat with the instinct, and she sat with what Mrs. Greer had said, and she sat with what the past 3 months had been, and she did the accounting that the situation required. The accounting produced something she had not entirely expected it to produce, which was anger. Not at Mrs. Greer, who had meant well, not at the community of Cedar Bend, which was doing what communities did, which was to notice what was noticeable and to have opinions about it. The anger was at the specific situation, at the way the situation she was in, which was the situation of a woman who was 26 and who had been a widow for a year, and who had met someone who was the first person in that year to offer something genuine without a cost attached to it. Was a situation that the community of Cedar Bend had a framework for that was different from the framework she wanted to use, and that the framework the community used required things of her that the framework she wanted to use did not, and that the choosing between frameworks was going to cost her something regardless of which one she chose. She sat with the anger for a while. Then she sat with the thing beneath the anger, which was the specific fear that she had been managing since January. The fear that had been present alongside the gratitude and the trust and the something else. The fear that was the specific fear of a woman who had organized her entire existence around not needing anyone, and who had discovered, in the 3 months since the general store that she did, that she needed the specific presence of August Ward and the specific way of someone who had been managing alone for too long, and had found in the company of someone who was capable of providing it. The relief of the managing together, and that the needing was real, and that the reality of it was frightening in the specific way of things that were real, and that could therefore be lost. She was afraid of losing it. She was afraid of it in the way she was afraid of things that mattered, not with the abstract anticipatory dread of someone who was worrying about a theoretical outcome, but with the specific concrete fear of someone who had something that mattered, and who was holding it with both hands and who understood that the holding was not a guarantee. She did not cry. She had cried in the general store in January, and it had been the right thing in that moment. And this was a different moment, and what this moment required was not crying but the specific honest accounting of where she was, and what she wanted, and what she was going to do about the wanting. And she sat with the accounting until she had done it completely, which took the rest of the afternoon. When Iris woke from the afternoon sleep and came out to the work table with the wooden horse still in her hand and asked whether August was coming tomorrow, Willa said, "Not tomorrow." She said, "Tuesday." Iris said, "Why is it always Tuesday?" Willa said, "Because Tuesday is when he comes to town." Iris considered this with the focused gravity of a 4-year-old working through a logical problem. She said, "What if we went to him on a not Tuesday?" Willa looked at her daughter. The small dark-haired face with the dark blue eyes that were her own eyes, and that were asking the question with the specific direct logic of someone for whom the solution to a problem was simply to go toward the thing you wanted. She said, "That is a very straightforward way to think about it." Iris said, "Is it wrong?" She said, "No." She said, "It's not wrong at all." She sat with that for the evening, with the specific quality of a 4-year-old's logic that had produced, in 4 words, the clearest summary of the accounting she had spent the afternoon doing. What if we went to him on a not Tuesday? The not Tuesday was the specific thing, the departure from the managed structure of the monthly visit, the departure from the arranged proximity of the sewing commission, the departure from the careful incremental quality of 2 people extending the available track record before making any commitment to the extension. The not Tuesday was the thing that was being asked of her. By Mrs. Greer's visit, inadvertently, by her own accounting, directly, and by Iris, who was 4 and who did not understand the social architecture of the situation, but who understood, with the unerring instinct of someone whose needs had not yet been complicated by experience, that the thing you did when you wanted something was go toward it. She went to the ward spread on a Saturday. Not the following Saturday. She needed the intervening week to finish the accounting and to make the decision in the specific way she made all important decisions, which was slowly and completely, and without rushing herself toward a conclusion, before the conclusion was ready. She went the Saturday after that, on a morning in the last week of April, when the weather had made its final argument for spring, and had won. When the ride out was through the specific quality of a Wyoming April morning that was genuinely warm in the direct sun, and that carried in the air the specific clean smell of country that had been under snow for months, and that was now, fully and without reservation, itself again. He was at the fence line when she arrived, working alone on a section that needed reposting. Moving through the task with the unhurried competence of someone for whom this work was as natural as breathing and who was doing it correctly without needing to think about the correctness. He looked up when he heard the horse, and he waited in the specific patient quality of his waiting, which did not rush toward her and did not perform the welcome, but was simply present and ready when she arrived. She dismounted. She stood for a moment at the edge of the fence line with the horse's reins in her hand, and the April morning around her, and the specific quality of someone who has done the accounting, and has arrived at the honest result, and is now going to say the honest result plainly, because the plain saying of it is what the situation requires, and what she is capable of, and what she believes he deserves. She said, "Mrs. Greer came to see me on Friday." He said, "I heard." She said, "How did you hear?" He said, "Cedar Bend is a small town." She said, "Yes." She said, "I sat with what she said for a week." He said, "What did you decide?" She said, "I decided that I'm tired of the situation being determined by what I'm afraid of, rather than by what I want." She said, "I've been afraid of this." She said it with the specific plain quality she had been learning from him, the plain quality of saying the true thing without decoration. He said, "I know." She said, "I don't want to be afraid of it anymore." He said, "Tell me what you want." She said, "I want you to keep coming on Tuesdays." She said, "And I want to stop managing the coming as though it's a practical arrangement, rather than what it actually is." He said, "What is it actually?" She said, "It's you and me, and Iris, and whatever this is, and I want to stop pretending it's a curtain commission." He looked at her with the dark green eyes in the April morning light, and something in his expression, which was his most contained expression, his characteristic stillness, shifted in the specific way. It shifted when something mattered, which was barely visible and entirely genuine. He said, "That's the most direct thing you've said to me." She said, "I've been working up to it." He said, "How long?" She said, "Since January." He said, "Since the general store." She said, "Yes." He said, "I know." He said, "I've been waiting for it." She said, "You have a lot of patience." He said, "For the right things." He said it with the dark green eyes and the specific plain quality and the April morning around them and the fence line between them. And she looked at him, and he looked at her, and the thing that had been present since January was present now with the specific completeness of something that had finally been named. She said, "August." He said, "Yes." She said, "I'm going to be honest with you about something." He said, "You've been honest with me about most things." She said, "About this, I haven't been." She said, "I needed the medicine you paid for in January, and I needed it for Iris, and I have not stopped being grateful for it. And I also—" She stopped. She said, "I also needed someone to say don't apologize for crying." She said, "Not the money." She said the 4 words. She said, "I needed someone to say those 4 words more than I have needed anything in a year, and I didn't know I needed them until you said them." He was very still. She said, "I'm telling you because you deserve to know that what you did was not a small thing, and that it mattered in a way that was larger than you probably intended it to matter." He said, "It was exactly as large as I intended it to be." She looked at him. He said, "I knew what I was saying." He said, "I said it because it was true, and because you needed to hear it, and because I was in a position to say it." She said, "That's a very simple way to describe something that changed the shape of my year." He said, "Simple things can change the shape of a year." He said, "That's one of the more reliable facts about how things work." She looked at him in the April morning for a long moment, and then she said, "Come for supper on Saturday, not the first Tuesday." "A Saturday," he said, I'll be there. She rode back to Cedar Bend in the April morning with the specific quality of someone who has said a true thing and has had it received in the way that true things deserve to be received. And the riding back was different from the riding back in January and February and March, was the riding back of someone who was not managing the situation from a distance, but was inside it. Actually inside it. And who had made a choice about being inside it that was not the result of fear or of circumstance, but of the specific honest accounting of what she wanted and the specific direct action of going toward it. What if we went to him on a not Tuesday? She had gone on a not Tuesday. The going had been exactly what she needed it to be. The Saturday supper was the first time he had been in the rooms above Mrs. Daltrey's dress shop, which were the specific domestic space of Willa's life in Cedar Bend. And the entering of them had a quality that was different from the ward kitchen and different from the front room of Mrs. Daltrey's shop where the curtained commission and the monthly visits had taken place. It was her space. The space she had made from the rented rooms with the practical intelligence of someone who understood that a space was what you made of it, and who had made these rooms into something that was genuinely hers, in the specific way that a home became yours when you had lived in it, through something difficult and had come out the other side of the difficult still inhabiting it. It was modest, and it was clean, and it had the specific quality of a space organized by a woman who was very good at doing a great deal with what was available. The work table positioned to catch the afternoon light, the shelf of books above the window that told him something specific about her. The corner where Iris's things were arranged with the particular order of a child who had been taught to respect the limits of a small space. The kitchen area that was simple and adequate, and that smelled, on the Saturday evening he arrived, of the specific smell of something that had been cooking for a while, and was nearly ready. Iris opened the door when he knocked, which she had clearly been positioned to do, and she told him that he was late, which he was not. He was on time, and she had been waiting for him since mid-afternoon, which was a different thing that she had not yet developed the vocabulary to distinguish. He said, "I'm exactly on time." She said, "I've been ready for a long time." He said, "I'll come earlier next time." She considered this and found it satisfactory, and let him in with the specific gracious authority of a 4-year-old, who understood that she was in charge of the door, and that the door was a position of considerable importance. Willa came from the kitchen area with the specific quality of someone who had been cooking, and who was carrying the comfortable confidence of someone in their own space doing something they were good at. And she looked at him in the rooms, and he looked at her in the rooms, and it was the first time they had been in this specific space together. And the specificity of it mattered in the way that first times mattered, which was not dramatically, but definitively. She said, "Sit anywhere." He looked at the chair by the work table, which was the largest chair in the room, and which he sat in with the specific physical consideration of a large man in a small space, angling himself so that the smallness of the space was not something she had to manage. She noted the consideration. She was noting many things about him now with the full attention, rather than the managed attention. And the noting had the quality of someone building a detailed picture of a person they had decided was worth the full attention. The supper was good. She cooked well in the specific way of someone who had learned cooking not as a performance but as a practical art, who understood the relationship between ingredients and heat and time, and who had built her specific knowledge of that relationship through the long sustained attention of someone for whom feeding herself and her child had been a matter of daily practical concern rather than a social occasion. He ate with the appreciation of someone who had been cooking for himself for a long time and who recognized good cooking when he encountered it. Not with the performance of appreciation, but with the genuine quality of it, which was attentiveness to what was in front of him, and the specific unhurried pleasure of someone who was not eating quickly, but eating well. Iris talked through most of the supper, which was her characteristic mode in the presence of people she had decided were safe. The specific comprehensive inquiry of a 4-year-old who understood that the adults at the table were a resource for information, and who was determined to extract as much of it as the meal permitted. She asked August about the horses by name. She had learned the names from the February visit and had been asking about them individually since. And he answered each question with the patient completeness she had come to expect from him. And Willa sat across the table and listened to the exchange and felt the specific quality of something that was simply right, in the way that things were right when they fit together correctly. when the pieces were what they actually were rather than what had been arranged for them to appear to be. After supper he helped clear the table, which he did without being asked, and without the self-consciousness of a guest performing helpfulness. Simply because the clearing needed doing and he was present and capable of doing it, and the doing of it had the same plain quality as everything he did. Iris fell asleep on the chair by the work table before the clearing was finished, in the specific sudden way of small children who were awake, and then were not, with the wooden horse in her arms. And Willa lifted her, and put her to bed with the practiced efficiency of long habit, and came back to the main room and sat at the table with the lamp burning and the April night outside and August ward across from her. And the specific quality of the moment was different from any of the previous moments, because it was the first moment that was entirely theirs. Without the professional frame of the curtain commission or the monthly visit, or the public space of the general store, or the ward kitchen. Simply two people at a table in the quiet of an April evening after a child had gone to sleep. She said, "I want to tell you something." He said, "Tell me." She said, "I have been afraid of this since January." She said, "I have been grateful for it, and I have been learning from it, and I have also been afraid of it. And I haven't told you that I've been afraid because telling you would have required me to acknowledge what I was afraid of losing. And acknowledging what you're afraid of losing means acknowledging that you have it, and I wasn't ready to acknowledge that I had it." He was still, the specific complete stillness of his full attention. She said, "I have it." She said, "I want you to know that I know I have it, and that I am not managing it as something that might go away if I look at it directly." He said, "Good." She said, "That's your word." He said, "It's a sufficient word." She said, "For most things." He said, "For this thing." She said, "August." He said, "Yes." She said, "I need to say something to you that is the hardest thing I've said to you." He said, "Say it." She said, "I needed someone to need." She said it plainly, with the full weight of the saying, because it was the truest thing she had, and it was the thing she had been most afraid to say. The thing that was more exposing than any of the things she had told him about Thomas, or about the debt, or about the 8 months of managing. Because those things were things that had happened to her, and this was a thing about who she was. About the specific interior need that she had been managing around for 8 months, and that she was now naming in the specific plain language he had shown her was available when you stopped managing and started saying. He said, "I know." She said, "You knew." He said, "I've known since January." She said, "Why didn't you say?" He said, "Because it was yours to say." He said, "I wasn't going to say it for you." She said, "That is a very specific thing." He said, "It's the right thing." He said, "You needed to arrive at it yourself." He said, "Me saying it would have made it about what I observed rather than about what you knew." She looked at him across the lamplit table in the April night, and she felt the specific quality of being known. Not known in the way of someone who had collected information about her and was deploying it, but known in the way of someone who had paid attention long enough and carefully enough that the knowing was thorough and was offered without agenda, and without the requirement that she be anything other than exactly what she was. She said, "What do you need?" He looked at her. She said, "I've told you what I need. I want to know what you need." He was quiet for a moment, the specific thoughtful quiet of someone giving the honest answer the consideration it deserved. He said, "I need what I told you I needed in February." He said, "The coming home to part." He said, "I've been managing without it for 11 years, and the managing has been sufficient, and it has also been in the way of things that are sufficient without being what you actually want. Not enough." He said, "I want the not enough to be different." He said, "I want to come home to something that isn't just the work." He said it with the specific plain quality of the most honest things he said. The quality that arrived when the content was important enough that the performance of the saying would have diminished it, and she received it with the full quality of her reception, which was everything she had. She said, "I'm going to say something and I want you to understand that I am saying it from a place of full honest accounting and not from fear or gratitude or any of the things that could be confused with what I'm actually saying. He said, "Say it." She said, "I want you to come home to us." She said, "Not as a practical arrangement." She said, "As the actual thing." He was very still. She said, "I want Iris to have someone to ask about horses who doesn't find the asking exhausting." She said, "I want someone to eat supper with who understands what the supper is actually for, which is not the food, but the sitting down together." She said, "And I want the person who said don't apologize for crying to be the person I am not apologizing for crying in front of, on the occasions when the crying happens, for the rest of the available occasions." She said it all with the specific plain quality that she had been learning from him, the plain quality of saying the true thing without decoration. And she held his gaze while she said it with the dark blue eyes that were doing their most complete work, which was the work of being entirely open. He stood from the table. He was so much larger than the room that the standing changed the scale of everything. But he moved with the specific careful deliberateness that was his characteristic management of his dimensions. And he crossed the small distance between his chair and hers, and he stood in front of her, and she stood because sitting while he stood was not the geometry the moment required. And she was standing, and he was in front of her with the dark green eyes at close range in the specific quality of an April night in a lamplit room after a child had gone to sleep. And he reached out and took her hands in both of his. His hands were large enough to hold both of hers entirely, the large calloused hands with the work history in every line of them. The hands that had reached past her in the general store in January and put the money on the counter and that had lifted Iris over the fence rail with the easy confidence of someone for whom the lifting was simply the obvious response to a small person needing to be on the other side of a fence. And the holding of them was the specific holding of someone who held things carefully and completely, and who did not let go of things he had decided were worth holding. He said, "I have been in love with you since the general store." He said it with the same plain quality as everything else, without the particular construction of a declaration. Simply as the honest statement of a thing that was true and that he had decided the moment warranted saying directly. He said, "I have known it since before the general store, probably. Since the 3rd or 4th month of watching you manage alone in a town that didn't know you, and that you were making yours through the force of your own competence." He said, "I didn't say it before now, because the before now was the time for showing it rather than saying it. And I needed to show it long enough that when I said it you would have the evidence to know that the saying was the same as the showing rather than a different thing." She looked up at him with the dark blue eyes in the lamplight, and she said, "That is the most specific thing you have ever said to me." He said, "It's the most important thing I've said to you." She said, "I know." She said, "August." He said, "Yes." She said, "I'm in love with you too." She said, "I have been in love with you since approximately the ward kitchen table in January when you said that simple was still available after a complicated year." He said, "That was the 2nd week of our acquaintance." She said, "You made an impression." He said, "Good." He said it with the specific completeness of the word, and she looked at him and said, "That is still your word." He said, "It's still sufficient." She said, "For everything." He said, "For everything." He was holding her hands and she was holding his, and the April night was outside the window, and Iris was asleep in the next room, and the lamp was burning its steady amber between them. And neither of them said anything for a long moment that contained everything that the previous 4 months had been building toward, without requiring any of it to be said again because it had been said completely and honestly, and in the specific plain language that they had been developing between them since January. Then she said, "You should ask Iris." He said, "About what?" She said, "About the coming home part." She said, "She has opinions about these things, and she will tell you what they are, whether or not you ask, but it would be better to ask." He said, "I intend to ask her." He said, "I intended to ask her before you told me to." She said, "Good." He looked at her with the dark green eyes. She said, "That's your word." He said, "I'm aware." He said, "I mean it the same way you mean it." She looked at him. She said, "I know you do." She said, That's why it works. The April night continued outside the window with the specific patient quality of Wyoming nights that had waited through the winter for the spring, and that were now simply the spring. Without the qualification of something that was in the process of becoming, simply the thing itself fully arrived. Entirely present. Available without condition to anyone who was paying attention, and who had been patient enough to wait for it. She had been patient enough. He had been patient enough. Iris was asleep in the next room, with the wooden horse in her arms. The coming home to part was no longer something that was missing. It was simply here. And it had been building, since a January morning in a general store, from the specific plain foundation of 4 words said plainly by a man who meant them entirely. And the foundation was solid in the way of things built correctly, and the thing being built on it was solid in the same way, and neither of them had any doubt about the solidity. Because they had each been doing the accounting since January, and the accounting had produced, every time, the same honest number, which was the number that said this was real, and that real was worth the building, and that the building was what they were doing, and that they were doing it together. Together was the specific word, the word that made the difference between the managing and the living. Together was what they were. May arrived in Cedar Bend with the full authority of a Wyoming spring that had finally committed to itself completely. That had moved past the tentative warmth of April into the genuine warmth of a season that had decided it was here, and intended to stay for the duration it was allotted. The valley was green in the lower sections, and the high slopes were showing the specific color of new growth against the remaining white of the upper elevations. And the creek that ran through the eastern edge of town was running high and clear with the snowmelt that was still coming down from the ridges, and that would continue for another month before the summer settled, the water into its calmer pace. It was the most beautiful time of year in Cedar Bend, which was a beautiful place in all its seasons, but that achieved, in May, the specific quality of beautiful that was available only to high country in the weeks when winter had finally completely released its hold, and the land was being itself without qualification for the first time in months. Willa noticed it. She had been noticing the world more since April. Since the Saturday supper and the conversation that had followed it, and the specific quality of something named and received, that changed the relationship between the person who had been carrying it, and the weight of the carrying. And the noticing of the May was the specific noticing of someone who was more present in the world they were inhabiting than they had been in the 12 months preceding. Present in the specific way that required interior surplus to sustain, and that was, in the May weeks, available to her in a way it had not been in the months of the managing. She was not managing alone anymore. This was the fact that she had been sitting with since the Saturday supper, sitting with it in the specific careful way she sat with important things. Giving it the full attention rather than the managed attention, and finding each time she gave it the full attention, that the fact was exactly what it appeared to be. Which was a genuine change in the specific architecture of her daily life that was producing real results in the quality of the daily experience of being alive in Cedar Bend, Wyoming. In the May of 1883. August came on the Tuesdays and he came on some Saturdays, and on the occasions when the ranch work permitted a midweek visit, he came on those as well. And the visits had the quality that things had, when they were simply the natural expression of what was actually happening, rather than the managed expression of what was being carefully arranged. He was present with Iris in the specific patient way that told Willa, every time she observed it, that the patience was not performed but genuine. The patience of someone for whom the questions of a 4-year-old about horses were worthy, questions that deserved complete answers. And for whom the specific logic of a 4-year-old's understanding of the world was interesting rather than exhausting. Iris had asked him, on the Tuesday after the Saturday supper, whether he was going to live with them. He had said, "I'm working on that." Iris had said, "You should work faster." He had said, "I'm working at the right speed." Iris had considered this and found it unsatisfactory but had accepted it with the specific resigned patience of a child, who understood that adults had their own pace and that the pace could sometimes be influenced but could not be controlled. Willa had been in the kitchen area when this exchange occurred, and she had not laughed, which had required a specific effort. And August had looked at her from across the room with the dark green eyes and a very early suggestion of a smile that was his most contained expression of amusement. And she had looked back at him, and the something that had been present since January was present in that moment, with the full weight of everything it had accumulated. She had told Mrs. Daltrey, not because Mrs. Daltrey had asked, though she had been asking in the specific, indirect way, of someone whose curiosity was considerable, and whose social intelligence told her that the indirect approach was more likely to produce information than the direct one. But because Willa had decided, in the week following the Saturday supper, that the managing of information was one of the specific forms of managing, she was no longer going to do. She had told Mrs. Daltrey simply and directly, in the way she told most things now, that August Ward and she had an understanding. And Mrs. Daltrey had received this with a warm satisfaction of a woman who had arranged the commission, that had arranged the visit, that had arranged the understanding. A satisfaction she felt no particular need to conceal. She said, "He's a good man." Willa said, "I know." Mrs. Daltrey said, "I knew he was a good man when he first started coming for the curtains 3 years ago." Willa said, "You could have told me." Mrs. Daltrey said, "You needed to find out for yourself." She said it with the specific wisdom of someone who had been watching people for 71 years, and who understood that some findings could not be arranged. The Waverly wedding dress was finished in the second week of May, 3 days before the wedding, and it was the best piece of sewing work Willa had done since coming to Cedar Bend. The specific quality of work that was produced when the interior state of the person doing it was better than it had been for the previous year and a half, when the hands that were executing the work were operating from a surplus rather than a deficit. Miss Waverly had been difficult in the specific way of clients who had ideas that exceeded their budget and whose ideas changed between fittings. And Willa had managed the difficulty with the diplomatic competence that was her professional mode. And the dress that the management had produced was something that made Miss Waverly cry when she tried it on the final time. Which was the specific crying of someone who had received more than they had known how to ask for. And which was a different thing from the crying in the general store, but that Willa received with the same warmth. Because crying was crying, and the specific thing she had learned in the 5 months since January was that crying was the evidence of something real, and that the evidence of something real was worth receiving with the full attention, rather than the managed attention. She told August about the Waverly dress on the Tuesday visit in the second week of May. She told him about the specific challenges of the commission, and about the final fitting and about Miss Waverly's crying. And he listened with the full quality and asked the questions that told her he had understood what she was describing, not the technical details of the sewing. Though he understood those better now than he had in January, but the specific quality of the work and what it represented, which was the evidence of her own recovery in the specific form that her recovery expressed itself, which was through the quality of the work. He said, "You're doing better." She said, "I know." She said, "It took me a while to notice it in myself." He said, "That's the way it works." He said, "The noticing comes after the being, not before it." She said, "When did you notice?" He said, "Before you did." She said, "When?" He said, "February." He said, "The first time you talked about the sewing without the specific quality that told me you were managing the talking rather than just talking." She said, "You could tell." He said, "I pay attention." She said, "I know you do." She said, "I'm getting better at letting you." He said, "I know you are." He said, "That's the work you've been doing." She said, "What work is that?" He said, "The work of letting things be what they are, instead of what they need to be managed into being." She looked at him. She said, "You make it sound simple." He said, "It's simple." He said, "It's not easy." She said, "What's the difference?" He said, "Simple means there's only one thing to do." He said, "Easy means it doesn't cost anything to do it." He said, "This is simple, and it costs." She said, "What does it cost you?" He said, 11 years of waiting to be ready for it." He said it with the plain quality of the most honest things, and she received it with the full quality of the full attention, and neither of them looked away. She had talked to Iris about August in the way that she believed Iris deserved. Directly and honestly, and without the particular softening that adults applied to conversations with children, when the adults were more uncertain than they wanted the children to know. She had said, "August is going to be part of our life." She had said, "He is going to come here, and we are going to go there, and it is going to be a thing that is part of how we live." Iris had said, "Is he going to be my father?" Willa had said, "He is going to be someone who loves you and takes care of you, and answers your questions about horses." She had said, "What that is called is something we will figure out together." Iris had considered this with the focused gravity of a 4-year-old working through a significant piece of information. She had said, "Is he going to bring more horses?" Willa had said, "You could ask him that." Iris had said, "I will." Willa had said, "I know you will." He asked her to marry him on a Saturday at the end of May, at the ward spread, in the corral where Iris was currently explaining to the brown mare the correct way to eat hay, which she had determined from an authoritative source that she declined to name. He asked her at the fence rail where they were both leaning, watching Iris in the corral with the mare, and the asking was in the same register as everything else he said to her that mattered, which was the register of plain and direct, and without the social construction of the moment. Simply the honest question offered to her without cost attached, and without the pressure of anything except the question itself. He said, "I want to ask you something." She said, "Ask." He said, "Will you marry me?" He said, "I know it's been 5 months, and I know you've been through a year of something hard before that, and I know you're still working on parts of it, and I'm not asking, because the working is done." He said, "I'm asking, because I want to be here for the rest of the working, and because the being here for it is better done as the thing it actually is, rather than as a thing that hasn't been named yet." He said, "And because Iris asked me yesterday whether I was going to live with you, and I told her I was working on it, and she told me I should work faster, and she's right." He said it all with the plain quality, and she stood at the fence rail and listened to it with the full attention, and felt the specific quality of something that had been building since a Tuesday morning in January when she had stood at a counter with coins in her hand that weren't enough, and that was arriving now at its natural completion, with the specific completeness of something that had been built correctly from the beginning, and that was on this Saturday in May with Iris in the corral, and the spring green of the valley all around them, simply done. She said, "Yes." She said it before the managing part of her could intercept the saying, which was not because the managing part had not been consulted, but because the managing part had completed its consultation and had produced the same result as every other consultation since January, which was yes. She said, "Yes." She said, "And I want you to know that I'm saying it from the full accounting, not from the gratitude or the fear of losing it, or any of the things that could be confused with the actual yes." She said, "It's the actual yes." He said, "I know." She said, "Good." She said it with his word, with the full weight of his word, with the specific completeness of his word, and he looked at her with the dark green eyes and said, "Yes, exactly that." And she looked back at him and they were both smiling. Not the very early suggestion of a smile, but the actual thing, full and genuine. And Iris called from the corral with something urgent about the mare's opinion of the hay situation, and they both turned toward her, together. In the specific, easy way they had been turning toward her together since the February Saturday when the ward spread had received them for the first time. There is a lesson in Willa Cross's story that does not require a general store in Wyoming, or a January morning, or a specific amount of medicine to be applicable. It belongs to anyone who has been standing at a counter with coins in their hand that were not enough, and who has been managing the not enough alone because the alternative required a vulnerability they were not certain they could afford. It belongs to anyone who has been strong alone for long enough that the strength became the identity, and the identity became the prison. And the prison was managed with such thoroughness that it stopped looking like a prison from the outside and started looking like simply how they were. The lesson is this: accepting help is not weakness. It is the specific courage that comes after you, have been strong alone long enough to know the difference between strong alone and strong together. And the difference is not that strong together is easier, because it is not easier. Because it costs something to receive help when you have spent a year proving you don't need it. But that strong together is stronger, in the specific way that things are stronger when they are not carrying the full load by themselves. When the load has been distributed across the specific architecture of two people who have decided to carry it in the same direction. August Ward had not rescued Willa Cross. She did not need rescuing. She was the furthest thing from a woman who needed rescuing. She was a woman who had been managing the unmanageable alone for 12 months, with a quality of competence that was genuinely impressive, and that had kept her and Iris alive and solvent, and housed and fed through a Wyoming winter on a seamstress's income. She did not need rescuing. What she needed was 4 words, said plainly in a general store, by a man who understood what he was saying, and meant every word of it. And what came after that was not rescue, but the specific incremental building of something that was stronger than what either of them had been managing alone. Built from the plain materials of honesty and patience and the specific quality of showing up consistently and doing what you said you would do and not requiring anything from the other person, except that they be exactly what they were. Don't apologize for crying. That was where it started. 4 words that were not a rescue, and were not a charity, and were not the particular social performance of a man making himself useful to a woman who might be vulnerable. They were the simple, true statement of a man who had been paying attention, and who understood, from the paying of it, exactly what was needed in that specific moment. Which was not money, and was not pity, and was not anything that required her to be less than, in order for him to be more than. But simply the permission to be human in a moment when she had run out of the capacity to be anything else. Don't apologize for crying. She had not cried again in front of him after that January morning. Not because she had been managing the crying, but because the thing that had produced the crying in the general store, which was the specific exhaustion of managing alone with no one to manage alongside, had been changing since that morning. Had been changing in the incremental way of things that changed when the conditions that had produced them changed, and the conditions had changed because August Ward had provided. In the consistent, patient, reliable presence of the monthly visits, and the Wednesday encounters, and the Saturday supper, and the April fence line, and all the specific accumulated evidence of a man who said what he meant, and meant what he did. The specific condition that had been missing, which was another person. She had needed someone to need. She had said that to him on the April evening. And it had been the hardest thing she had said to him, and it had been the truest thing she had said to him, and it had been the thing that had changed the shape of what they were. From something she was managing from a distance into something she was actually in. The needing was not weakness. The needing was the specific, honest acknowledgement of a truth about what human beings required that she had been managing around for 12 months, because managing around it had felt safer than acknowledging it. And the acknowledging of it had cost her something. In the specific way that true things always cost something when you finally say them. But the cost had been worth it, because the other side of the cost was this. May. At the Ward spread. And a man asking her to marry him at a fence rail while their daughter explained hey to a brown mare. Their daughter. She had thought that, standing at the fence rail, and the thinking of it had arrived before she could review it for accuracy, and she had let it stand, because it was true in the way that mattered. In the way of things that were not the official record, but that were the actual fact. And the actual fact was that the man standing beside her had been answering Iris's questions about horses with the patient, complete attention of someone who found the questions as worthy as any other questions. And that this was what the actual fact of a father looked like when it was the genuine article rather than the title, and that the genuine article was what Iris had, and that it had arrived. As the most important things arrived. Through the specific channel of a January morning in a general store when everything had finally exceeded its capacity, and a man had reached past her and put the money on the counter and had said, "Don't apologize for crying." She had not apologized. She had not needed to. What she had needed was exactly what she had been given, and what she had been given had produced, in the 5 months since January, a life that was larger than the life she had been managing toward. That had more in it than the managing alone had been able to produce. That was the specific life that was available to two people who had each been strong alone for long enough to understand that strong together was something different, and who had chosen. In the specific plain way they both chose things to be that. Willa Cross had arrived in Cedar Bend 8 months before the January morning, with a sewing kit and a 4-year-old daughter, and the particular focused determination of someone who had decided that forward was the only available direction. She had been right about that. Forward was the direction, and she had moved in it with everything she had. What she had not known when she arrived was that forward was not a direction you had to move in alone. That there were specific people in the world who understood the moving and who were capable of moving in the same direction with the same quality of commitment. And that finding one of those people was not a thing that happened through arrangement or through strategy or through any of the careful management she had been applying to the other aspects of her life, but through the specific channel of being exactly where you were and being exactly what you were and being in the right place at the right time, when someone who was paying the right kind of attention was in the same place at the same time. She had been in the right place. He had been paying the right kind of attention. The rest had been the slow, careful, honest building of something that was going to last. In the specific way of things built correctly by people who understood that the foundation was more important than the speed and who were willing to take the time the foundation required. Iris stopped explaining hey to the mayor and turned around and looked at them with the specific 4-year-old's assessment of what was currently happening with the adults. She said, "Are you going to kiss?" They looked at her. They looked at each other. He said, "Eventually." She said, "When is eventually?" He said, "That's between your mother and me." Iris considered this. She said, "I think eventually should be soon." She said it with the complete authority of someone who has been thinking about this for some time and who has arrived at a firm position on the matter. Willa looked at the ground for a moment, and then looked at August, and he was looking at her with the dark green eyes and the actual smile. The full one. The one that transformed his face in the way that genuine expressions transformed faces when they were not being managed. And she looked back at him with the dark blue eyes and she was smiling too. Actually smiling. Fully and without qualification. And Iris was watching from the corral with the patient authority of a 4-year-old who understood that she had made an important contribution to the proceedings and who was now waiting for the contribution to be recognized. He said, "Your daughter is very specific." She said, "She gets it from somewhere." He looked at her. She looked at him. Iris waited. It was, as it turned out, not very long until eventually. And it was everything that eventually was supposed to be, simple and genuine and entirely theirs, in the specific way of things that had been built correctly from the beginning and that were now, in the May of 1883, simply the life that was theirs to live. With the ward spread and the sewing work, and the brown mare and the wooden horse, and the Tuesday visits and the Saturday suppers, and the specific quality of a child who asked direct questions and received complete answers, and who had decided, with the unerring instinct of someone whose needs had not yet been complicated by experience, that this was exactly right. It was exactly right. It was the simple thing that had been available all along, on the other side of the managing. Waiting with the patient quality of simple things for the person who needed it to stop managing long enough to receive it. She had stopped managing. She had received it. That was the whole of the story. That was everything.